was putting together a video and I was really going to take a close look at where are the gaps in prices between different grades. So I was looking at SGC, I was looking at PSA. Was it between the 5 and the 6, the 6 and the 7, the 4 and the 3? Where were the big jumps? Because to me, those are the areas to target. And before I knew it, the content and the data that I was pulling led me in a completely different direction. I ended up going into a deep dive on 10 pretty cool vintage cards from the early 50s to the early 60s. And what I did was I really analyzed the prices, and I analyzed the prices between PSA and SGC. And there were a few things that really stood out that I think everybody needs to know. I'm kind of a data geek. I kind of like looking at numbers and seeing if there are patterns and analyzing it and seeing if there's some sort of trend. I do this all the time with my work. I'll look at test scores, I'll look at data and try to see where are some areas that can be improved. And I really think there were a couple of things that stood out in this data that I pulled. I hope that you check it out. I hope you watch the whole thing, because there are some conclusions throughout it that I think are pretty important to know. And I just had to share it. Video's a little longer than some that I do because I just had to cover this and share this with everyone. I really think it could be helpful. Check it out. Tell me what you think about this data.
All right, so in we go to this data dive. I want to take you through the process of how I got this data and why I think it's so important. So first off, I'm doing this off of eBay just because of the volume of sales in eBay. So we're looking up a 1960 Willie McCovey rookie card. First thing to look at, when you look here at PSA versus SGC, look at the difference in how many cards are listed by PSA grades versus SGC grades. That's significant. So I'm going to start with PSA, and then of course I want to go to the sold auctions. And if you look here, you will see I'm just kind of taking a quick look at all of the cards. Now, I focus on auctions because that eliminates some anomalies. Another thing is I do this by hand. So see how that says miscut right there? So that's a miscut card. So that would throw off the averages if I just use something like a card ladder, or up above here, you know, eBay has its own tracking. And you'll see these big spikes and stuff because eBay can't think. It doesn't understand that maybe it's for the all-star and the regular. You can see in the list here, there's some all-stars in here. There are some regular rookie cards in here. So I can't trust their data, so I do it all by hand. So let's take a look. So what I did is these are all the grades from 1 to 7, and I have 44 cards. And this is a 57 maze. So I did 10 different cards and I found the averages. So if you look across here, these are all of the different grades in a 4. And then I calculated out the average in Excel. So by hand, I found each card over the last 3 months in the 57 maze. Now I also looked it up for SGC. And again, I have the same grades 1 through 7. You'll see there are only 9 that have sold in SGC versus 44 for PSA. But when you look across here, I listed out all the 3s and I found the average. And I did that for any grade that had the card. So I chose 10 cards. So I have a 55 Killebrew here, right? And I've got the 55 Jackie Robinson. Now you'll see some of the cards, there are lots of cards graded, lots of 6s in the McCoveys, for example. Lots. This is a 62 Lou Brock. For PSA, lots of 6s, but just 1 for SGC. And I'm going fast, but don't worry. You will see this data accumulated. I'm just showing you where I tabulated it, and then we're going to focus on some of the summary information. So I went through these 10 cards, and each of the 10, every time a card sold, in the last 3 months, I listed out every single one that didn't have a qualifier that was an auction, and I found the averages for you. Now, what I did is I took all of those and I pulled the data into a summary. So instead of having all that information, we had just some information that we could focus on. So let's take a quick look one at a time. So 1957 Topps Willie Mays. You'll see I highlighted the cards where there is an SGC and PSA that was graded. And ideally, and in a lot of cases, there were multiple that were sold in those grades. And that way we can compare side by side how SGC did against PSA for all of the grades 1 through 7. Now the first thing, if you look down at the bottom, there are 44 1957 Willie Mazes that have sold in the last 3 months, and far fewer of the SGC. Now in the PSA 1 and PSA 3, two that we could compare head to head, the PSA average was higher than the SGC average, but one of them, SGC, had a higher average, right? So the SGC 5 averaged higher than the PSA 5. So let's go to the 59 mantle. Again, there's a huge discrepancy in how many cards are selling, and it's probably because of the population. There are not as many SGC cards that have been graded, which is part of the problem, which we'll get to later. So we have 4 different grades where there is a head-to-head comparison, and PSA came out ahead in the 3.5, the 4, and the 5. And the SGC had a higher average for the grade of a 1. And it was $12.83 higher. So I have who won and then how much they won by. And again, we're going to have a summary of the summaries. And I want to move through this quickly so I don't lose your attention. But we're going to go through all 10 of these. And all of this data is really interesting to me. Now, the 54 Ernie Banks, not very many of either have sold. It's a pretty expensive card, so that's fairly normal. But a lot more, again, PSAs than SGCs. The only one where there was the same grade in the last 3 months that there was a sale for PSA and SGC. And again, the PSA is on the left and SGC is the right column all the way through. And in this case, the PSA sold for more in the 7 grade by $809. Now again, that's just one grade of one card. And we're going to look at a summary of the summaries here in a minute. So again, pulled all the data, got the averages. Now we're comparing the averages. So again, the column on the left is PSA, column on the right is SGC. 2 head-to-head where there is the same grade. 3 and 4. And in this case, both times the PSA is selling for more. Now, it's not just the dollar amount that you want to kind of think about of what it's selling for more, but like what percentage. So in the 4, right, if you look at the 4, that's a huge percentage more that the PSA is averaging than the SGC. And then again, take a look at the total number of sales, because I think that's important to take note of. And I'm going to talk about that here in a couple of minutes. So next up, we have the 55 Harmon Killebrew. So in here, we had quite a few have sold. Not as expensive of a card, so it's more common to be having transactions. And in 4 of the 5 head-to-head comparisons that we had, PSA came out on top, and you can see the amount more. Again, you got 1972, 2565 more, 4013, and 2455 more. But then the SGC came out ahead in the 2.5 grade, and it was $6.75 more in its average sale price than the PSA. A lot of people have been asking me lately, hey, what do you think about the values of PSA and SGC? And I'm going to continue to monitor if they're close. Now, in the 55 Jackie Robinson, we have, again, 4 that are in the head-to-head comparison. And in all 4 cases, the PSA came out ahead. Now, again, percentage-wise, you say, oh, $30, $40, $60. Percentage-wise is what you want to kind of be thinking about. That's about 10 to 15% more that the PSA is selling for than the SGC. Again, PSA on the left, SGC on the right. So in the 58 Hank Aaron, we have 5 different grades that there is a head-to-head comparison because there were sales in the last 90 days. And what we've got here are 3 of the 5 PSA sold for more, and the percentages are pretty high in this one that PSA sold for more than SGC, whereas in the SGC 2.5 it was barely ahead, but in the PSA and SGC 5 grades, the SGC was way ahead. So again, out of the 5, 2 SGC's average was higher and 3 PSA's average was higher. So we're looking at, again, 10 different cards in all of these different grades from 1 through 7. And these are not cards with qualifiers. So Lou Brock, one of the things that stood out to me on this one is that Lou Brock, there are not many SGC graded sales. And again, that's probably because there are not many SGC graded Lou Brock cards. And when we look at the 3, where we have a head-to-head in all 3 cases, PSA came out ahead, not by much in the 3. Percentage-wise, a decent percentage in the 5. And then the percentage is more in the 6. So the higher the grade, the higher the percentage tends to be. Got a couple more here. We got the 53 Yogi Berra. And again, 3 head-to-head comparisons. We've got PSA is the winner by quite a big margin, percentage-wise, in the 1.5. And then SGC by a little bit in the 2. And then in the 5, PSA is a lot more. What's that? About 35% or so more in the 5 grade. So what tends to be happening is the higher the grade, the bigger the percentage win for PSA when PSA is winning. And again, in this case, SGC, what's that, about 8% or so higher than PSA for the PSA 2. Now again, take note throughout at the PSA, the left column, total cards that have sold versus SGC. And it should not be a shock that there are more PSA sales than SGC because the population reports of PSA is significantly higher of all of these cards than SGC's. And so we have here 2, 1 went to SGC and 1 went to PSA. Both by right around 10%, just under 10% for the PSA win. Again, some of these cards had a lot of sales and some of them didn't. I had no idea when I picked the 10 cards. I just kind of picked 10 pretty popular cards from the early 50s to the early 60s. And when we look here in a minute, we will see a summary report of the summaries. And then we can start thinking about some conclusions. So there we go. So when we look here, PSA in 1s won once. PSA in 1.5s won twice. PSA in 2s won 3 times. PSA in 3s won 6 times. So this is at each grade how many times PSA had the higher average. Now, one thing I really think we need to look at here is of the 7 times SGC won, 5 of those were in grades below 3. If you look at grades 3 through 7, look at how many times PSA had the higher value in the sale. And then kind of randomly in a grade of 5, it was 3-2 in PSA's favor. But again, when we look there in the grades of 1, 1.52, and 2.5 at the top, those are where SGC seems to be doing the best. So 5 of the times SGC had the higher average. Out of the 7 times, it was in a grade below 3. So if you have a high grade card, PSA tends to be quite a bit more valuable. In the lower grades, it doesn't seem to be as big of a difference. Now, out of all of those grades where there was a head-to-head comparison, 25 times PSA had the higher value and 7 times SGC had the higher value. Please consider subscribing to my channel. All right, so when we look at this summary, this is the number of PSA cards that have sold in all grades and SGC cards that have sold in all grades for each of the 10 cards. And to me, this is the biggest concern for fans of SGC. The fact that there are so many more cards that have been graded by PSA than SGC. The fact that so many more are selling in PSA than SGC. When so many nice cards, so many great cards are already in PSA holders, that's a problem. And one of the reasons it's a problem is because if there aren't as many SGC cards that have been graded by each, they should actually be selling for more. Because if you're an SGC fan and a collector of a specific card, there aren't as many out there in that grade for you than there are in PSA holders. So the fact that SGC cards are selling for less and there are fewer of them, the supply of them is smaller, and there are less options to find that card you want, that is something to be concerned about.
Every single time I do a video on SGC versus PSA, I have people accusing me of being in the bag for SGC and others accusing me of being in the bag for PSA. I'll be completely honest with you. I want SGC to catch PSA. And the reason I want them to catch PSA is because the better the competition is between the two. If SGC is going toe-to-toe with PSA, it's going to make PSA raise their game. It's going to make PSA's prices come down. It's going to make PSA's turnaround time come down. It's going to make their quality go up. It's going to have to if SGC can catch them. So I am actually not for one or the other. What I am for is them being head-to-head rivals. I want Verizon versus AT&T. I want Toyota versus Honda. I want Chevy versus Ford. I want SGC to go head-to-head with PSA, because if they do, it will increase the quality, it will decrease the cost, and it will decrease the turnaround times. And all of those are good for us as collectors. I want choices, but I want strong competition to bring up the quality and bring down the price. Tell me what you think about this analysis. I think it's pretty interesting.
I look forward to reading your comments. Let me know what you think about this. Very interested in it.